Welcome back, everyone, to the CDP Awards 2024, taking place here in Paris at the foot of the Eiffel Tower in the sidelines of the ChangeNOW, the 7th edition of the ChangeNOW Summit. Lovely to see you all. You're very, very welcome back. And as promised, it is time now for our second panel, which is all about the systematic changes that are needed on how we can redirect money that is used on activities that are, quite frankly, ruining our planet. The question, of course, what regulation do we need that's fit for purpose and can set the right conditions for investment? And the second question that we've heard already a lot today, who will pay? Who will pay for this transition? For this panel, I'm delighted to be joined by four esteemed guests, starting with Michiko Suka. She's the European Office Representative of the Asian Development Bank. Peter Oswald is here as well with us, the CEO of the Group. Sophie Anderson, the Lord Mayor of Copenhagen, is also with us in Paris today. And last but not least, Ilse Henne, the Executive Board Member of ThyssenKrupp. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you.
Peter Oswald, blessed among women there.
Yes.
On today's panel. It should be feisty, I'm sure. What we've heard today is we need to move faster. The science is clear. Everyone in this room is perfectly aware of what is at stake. Maxwell Weiss as well was very clear in his opening remarks as well. But what one system level barrier most needs overcoming, do you think, to finance and deploy climate solutions at the pace that is required? Perhaps as we start with you?
Oh, it's always difficult to name one. We heard many already in the panel just before us. I think it's always a balance between what do we need to do as an industry amongst us? How can we build networks that anticipate the transition and the investment that it needs into the transition on the one side, and on the other hand, of course, it also needs the right policies. It needs the right setting for industry policy. I think we need to rethink, especially for us as a steel producer, of course, what do we do in terms of trade, defense, etc. So it's very multifaceted, but it's always a combination between building networks, as we already heard in the earlier panel, and then setting the right tone by policymakers.
Indeed, it's always about finding that combination, if you like. Let's bring in now your perspective from the Asian Development Bank on that question.
I think the simple answer is we need good projects, implementable projects and scalable projects, and we're talking about moving the money, and it's one important aspect to catalyze the money, to have the enabling environment to catalyze money, but it's also important, equally important, to have projects that are implementable, that address sustainability, that address the climate, and that address nature, and it's not always straightforward.
Yeah. No, it is not always straightforward. That is why we're here together trying to find solutions all together. Peter, you are the CEO of the largest carton board producer in the whole of Europe. So what would your perspective be on this challenge? What needs to change in our economic system if we really want to reach those targets of net zero?
Yeah, I see there is still a hesitation to give the right incentives. And I just give two examples. Let's say in Poland, we invest now in renewable energy. So we have two projects. One was in renewable energy. The other one is simply expanding our production. Today, we don't see any difference in terms of, for the one we get a subsidy, for the other we get no subsidy. For the one we get, let's say, a long-term cheaper loan. For the other, we don't get it. They're equally treated. So you get the dilemma as a manager to say if the one project is a 15% return project and the other one is a 20% project, you should do the 20% project, but the 15% project is the one about renewable energy, where we say we already have 68% and we want now to go to 80%, for instance. Another example, I was really admiring the European Parliament when they passed this plastic tax, where they said there are so much environmental costs associated with plastic in the ocean, etc. So we put a tax on it. But of course, the tax should be paid by those who originate it. And then no government dared to implement it. So we all, our company, which is no plastic, pays taxes for plastic, and we all as as ordinary citizens pay for it. And I think there, and I was asking our environmental minister in Austria, so yeah, and she said, yeah, lobby is too strong. And if you don't give the right incentives, it's very difficult just to appeal to people to make decisions where there are no incentives or no punishment, so to say. So there we need to get more, have more courage.
Okay, very interesting point there from Peter. Same question to you from the perspective of being the mayor of Copenhagen.
Well, I think that for many, many years in Copenhagen, we have managed to finance climate adaptation plans in public-private sharing and sharing of the risks. And we also had a government that said that it was okay for us to do investments in renewable energies and use tariffs as a system for the people who get district heating or get the energy out of it, that they could actually pay for some of these investments. So far, so good. But now we are moving into new territory. We're going to make a new climate action plan, and we're going to look at the Copenhageners, the footprints of the Copenhageners. And what we see is that, for instance, the built environment, when it comes to our city and how we need to renew our city all the time, at the same time having even more Copenhageners, now it's getting pretty difficult, because if we build a school where we reuse the buildings and where we reuse the materials instead of using up new resources all the time, it's going to be more expensive. And who is going to pay for that? In all cities around the globe, we see the cost of living is rising, and especially on the market of housing. And now we come here and we say, and you need to reuse, and you need to be more aware of the energy that you're using, and you need to do the investments, but sometimes the investments make the housing 10% more expensive. And that is very difficult to work with in the city. So I don't have all the answers today, but I'm just saying that when it comes to climate crisis, cost of living, we need to find a way into how do we manage to move forward.
That's the reality on the ground, that you're painting a perfectly clear picture of your city, a similar conundrum for cities all across the continent. You mentioned what's keeping you up at night, Peter Oswald, and what you dislike. But what about policy networks and specific changes in markets and policy frameworks that could accelerate your transition investments?
Yeah, it's actually what I said before. It's incentives. You have to, if you want people to change, of course you can appeal to them. And we heard the example from our valued customer Bayersdorf, that you say, I just absorb more costs and make it happen. But you could have incentives, both positive and negative. I mean, we are used to it. If we go to the petrol station, we pay not so much for the petrol, but we mainly pay taxes. And that's right, because we want to avoid it, and it's one way to steer it. And that should be used more. But of course it's difficult, because in a democracy you want to be elected, so you have always interest groups who defend their interests. But it is all about incentives, making the right incentives. And it's good, for instance, that the CO2 price is where it is, and it should be 100. That's actually what we calculate for all our capex, because then we can justify to do something against it. If the costs fell tomorrow to 10, then it's more difficult. You still want to do it as a company, but it's difficult to justify it.
Ilse, what about you? Any specific policy frameworks?
I think it's of course about incentives, but I think what is even more important is that we understand that in order to create what I call an industrialized but decarbonized Europe, we're going to need to focus on building other kinds of networks. Yeah? There is nobody who can industrialize or decarbonize this industry on its own, in its own industry. I think we really need to cooperate. Looking for us, for example, at our steel mill, we need green hydrogen. Yeah? And we cannot for green hydrogen, we need a lot of green electricity. And we cannot create this green energy ourselves. We need to cooperate with other companies. We can offer stability in demand, and then you need an infrastructure being built. Incentives can help, but I still see that very often we try to solve the problems in a too isolated way.
And why is there not more cooperation? What's hindering it?
Well, I think it's about thinking it's about thinking in new ways, of course, so we need to overcome some biases that we have, but of course it's also about each of us building sustainable economies, sustainable in the way that we need to make money also with our green business models. So there is always a trade-off that is on the table, and I think next to incentives, wanting to overcome this trade-off and thinking more long-term is definitely also what we need.
More long-term thinking, indeed. And just when it comes to development banks, what role can they play here in funding or in putting up funding to signal investors towards projects that are, of course, beneficial for society and for the climate?
I think staying in line with what we just talked about, in addition to incentives, we need to address the risks that exist. So today we've spoken a lot about Europe. I am from the Asian Development Bank, so we represent the Asian Pacific countries. And there we talk a lot about how we can de-risk the situation, how we can create an enabling environment. So there are political risks, there are financial risks, there are implementation capacity risks. So all of these, and each country, each sector, each region is different. So there's no one fits for all response. We have to have a tailored approach to each of these situations. So what we do is we address and work together with governments to address the risks that are there in order to create an environment that's enabling for the private sector to come in. That's the incentive, to create the incentives or create the environment where governments can create the incentives for the private sector to come in. And then we talked about cooperation. I'd like to use an example from the Philippines. Many Asian countries, including Philippines and Vietnam, they're moving towards offshore wind. So there's a lot of knowledge and technology that's present in Europe that can be used in these situations, that can be applied for a lot of opportunities for European companies. And one bottleneck, amongst many bottlenecks, is of course the policy environment. So the Philippines is working towards having a policy environment to enable offshore wind to be a possibility. But then there's one bottleneck that is not a straightforward bottleneck. It is even though the Philippines has a lot of ports, none of the ports are big enough for a ship to dock that carries the blades in order to have an offshore wind farm. So you would have to also address the infrastructure problem. So I think we talked a lot about cooperation, and I think what that also entails is cooperating across sectors, across disciplines, and with partners that traditionally might not have been a partner.
Could you weigh in there perhaps with some advice on how to promote this cooperation?
Well, in Copenhagen, we are a member of C40, and that's an international mayors forum where we work together in partnerships. And for the last couple of years, Copenhagen has been working very closely with Buenos Aires, for instance, on reducing public energy, energy in public buildings. We've been working with them how to do even more green city developments, and now we're moving on to Johannesburg and also Sao Paulo. So these are some of the ways that we can knowledge share, that we can use each other as a means of innovation and scale up things that has been working in one part of the world and trying to do that with other parts of the world in itself. But I must also say, when it comes to Copenhagen in itself, I also see partnerships as a very important thing. In Copenhagen, in the Copenhagen area, we made the Energy Leap partnership or the network, where we worked very closely together with the companies, both public and private, when it comes to energy and energy saving. And we have been working together to make sure that the incentives are there to save energy and to save money that can be spent on investing on renewable energies, for instance. And I think that is one way ahead, as long as with public procurements, that is another tool in our toolbox as a city.
And we all know, of course, here that Copenhagen is known for its carbon neutrality target. How close are you, and what's been the cost? And have you already calculated the positive return on this investment for the citizens of Copenhagen?
Well, we have been working on this, on becoming climate neutral since 2012, and we are supposed to reach it in 2025, I'm sorry. And by 2025, we are going to have reached it by 84%. So we're not quite there yet, but it's still, since the baseline was 2010 and we reduced since then 84%, we come along the way, but we're not quite there yet, so we are moving forward still. We are also making a new climate action plan for 2035, where we are moving from scope 1 and scope 2 to looking at scope 3, means that every Copenhagener's footprint is now we are going to take that into account. Because if you look at it only in a geographical way, like the UN way, and we look the benchmarking, Copenhagen is at the very front. I think every citizen is using around 1 ton of CO2 emission a year. But when you look at it as part of the rich global north, we're not even there. I mean, it's embarrassing.
You're not even there.
No, we're not even there. And,
well,
and it's embarrassing, and we need to take that into account. So this is kind of a new way to look at it. And if we're taking into the Copenhageners' CO2 footprints, partnerships, it's certainly what we're going to do, because as a municipality, we cannot tell our citizens to not drive the car with gasoline or not eating a beef or something like that. We have to work very closely together, and also closely together with business. And
we'll check in with you next year to see have you reached that goal. Best of luck with it. But let's go back to Peter there to hear more about investing in this change that is so much needed. What financial challenges and costs are involved in shifting from fossil fuels to renewables to power your mills? And what is your timeline?
Yeah, I mean, we've committed to this scientific target of maximum 1.5%, which means we have to reduce our carbon emissions by 2031 by more than 50%. And this means, so we have cut our carbon emissions since 2019 by about 25%. So we are in line with our target, but we need to spend, in our case, at around 600 million to finally get there. This is, of course, is a challenge.
And where exactly are you getting that money?
No, first of all, we earn the money. Hopefully we earn the money, but we also, of course, have to take loans. And this leads me back to the question, today we don't see in practice a differentiation between, let's say now an investment, as I said at the beginning, into renewable energy and any other investment which has no carbon advantage.
And does your ambition and also your transparency help in getting that money?
Yeah, it's not a question. We finally do get the money because we're a solid company, but it's sometimes difficult to judge from a return point of view. So we invested a lot in photovoltaic, but then you see that we need obviously energy just at the time. So when we can use our photovoltaic, the electricity price is also at a low level, and so if you calculate it very thoroughly, you see that it's a pretty long payback time.
Absolutely.
That's obviously a problem.
Absolutely, indeed. And just going back over to you there, what stories can you share with us from successful investments in new technologies and perhaps as well from unsuccessful ones?
Okay, so maybe coming back to your earlier question about when do we want to be climate neutral in a diversified group like ThyssenKrupp, we have different targets. We also committed to SBTi. Of course, some of our activities, we will be climate neutral already in 2030, if you look at our material services business. But of course, if we look at our most polluting or most CO2 emitting part of our group, it's the steel making part. There we are currently investing 3 billion until 2027. In order to reduce over 600 million of CO2 emission. It's one of the largest industrial decarbonization projects worldwide. And as to your question, how the funding is taking place, of course, there's the money that we earn, there's the loans that we get, but there is, of course, also public funding. which CDP rating helps in terms of getting that done. It was a specific requirement we had in the discussions when getting the public money. And what I would like to point out, because I think it's important, coming back to my point to the network, we got 2 billion, it's not a secret, it was everywhere in the newspapers, we got 2 billion public funding to decarbonize our steelmaking industry. But more than 2/3 of that actually go in creating a hydrogen infrastructure, a green hydrogen infrastructure. And that will help the whole industry that we have in North Rhine-Westphalia, in the western part of Germany. So I think it's important, again, coming to your point, that it's about cross-pollination also when public funding is taking part. So apart from decarbonizing our own activities, of course, we also have a lot of what we call enabling technologies. These are technologies we apply to help our customers to decarbonize, for example, in the cement industry, or building plants for green ammonium that can be a carrier of green energy. Also there, in terms of what can lawmakers do, what we see is that today the EU taxonomy is not fully serving its purpose. Yeah? Half of what we are investing is eligible. It's mainly our steelmaking investments, the change to the direct reduction plant, but many other things that we do are not EU eligible, EU taxonomy eligible, and I think that's also something we need to rethink. And I think an organization like CDP can be very instrumental there in pushing that change.
Indeed. We've talked, of course, a lot about climate, but what about nature? I mean, climate is just one part of the problem. There's also nature, which has been taken for granted for decades, has had no price. How can we address this systematic mispricing of biodiversity risk in the financial sector?
I think investing in nature needs to be seen more valuable as exploiting it. I mean, that's the simple answer. And I think traditionally, nature-based solution projects were funded by public money. We see now that the funding gap in nature-based solutions is so vast, public money cannot do it on its own. So we need to crowd in private sector money and other sources of funding. However, for the private sector, as many of you are coming from the private sector, you need a return. You need a return that you can measure, that you can also report back and have a profit on. But it's not always straightforward. So I think for the private sector to invest in nature-based solution is still a new idea. We need to, by we, I mean governments, ADB works with governments, needs to make it easier for private sector to be able to measure the profits that are coming from nature-based solutions. We need to create the taxonomies that makes it measurable. And we need to have good projects that will pose a return. And just quickly, last year the ADB launched a Nature Solution Finance Hub at the last year's COP. And what this nature-based solution finance hub is trying to do is, in fact, working with governments in order to create this enabling environment for the private sector to come into nature-based solutions. So this year we are preparing bankable projects, we are preparing pipelines for many countries, and we are also trying to understand what the risk barriers are for the private sector to come into nature-based solutions. And we are trying to help governments to make the case that it is worth coming in and you can have a return on your investment by investing in nature-based solutions.
Okay, very positive message there. Thank you for that. Because as it stands, 7 in 10 companies in Europe are dependent on at least one ecosystem device. So I'm curious, Peter, from your perspective, how does Group measure its dependence on nature?
Yeah, I mean, we are very dependent on nature because we use 2 raw materials. One is forests, and we are very proud that we work only with natural forests, also with mixed forests, both hardwood and softwood. And on the other hand, we produce a lot of products then with recycled material. So with the advantage we can use the material up to 25 times for our material. We don't get there quite because we have a recycling rate of around 86, 87%. So if you calculate this, it means we use it on the average 8 or 9 times, but this is still outstanding compared with many other recycling opportunities which exist in other industries. And so we also always say it's not about recyclability. I think that was over the last 10 years, it's now about recycling at scale. So it's not just important that you can recycle it, but do you recycle it? How often do you recycle it? And do you downcycle, or can you, I don't know the term, but can you recycle it into the same quality of products?
Okay.
And that's important for us.
Would you like to weigh in there?
No, I was just saying, you were saying downcycling, I was thinking upcycling. It's also for us, for example, already in 2016, we started a project to do a carbon capturing of our steel mill and use it then as a basic ingredient for ammonium or for methanol. So it again crosses different industries. So we talk about almost upcycling there, because it used to be a waste and now it's being used.
And back to your perspective there from the Asian Bank, should taxes on high-impact businesses fund green policies, do you think, given increasing public debt and resistant as well to climate policy costs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe not exactly on taxes, but one project I like to use an example, and which France is actually has proposed last year at the Gabon Forest Summit. Maybe you're aware of it. It's debt for nature swaps. So where in order to, France has suggested, and ADB is supporting it, to work with governments to excuse their debts in return for investments in biodiversity and forests. Yeah.
I'd like to bounce that idea off you.
I was just nodding, but I can agree to it.
What about you, Peter?
Yes, yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. And yourself?
Well, we sure need funding for diversity, but we also need funding for the cities. And as I mentioned before, one part is getting financial and making green norms or CO2 taxations in Europe and other places. And I think we should move on making standards, good standards in European Union. But I really think that we ought to look more into some of the cities in the global south. How do they finance? Mm-hmm. And one thing is biodiversity, but some of them just lack common sense infrastructure when it comes to clean water, when it comes to energy, when it comes to making sure that there's actually green infrastructure in transportation and everything like that. So just let's not forget that.
Yeah.
Let's not forget common sense. I mean, that's pretty practical advice.
Maybe on that one, in the Asia-Pacific region, we estimate that annually we need about $1.7 trillion for infrastructure. And that's not just for green. Green from that is 200 billion, right? There is still a need for what you just mentioned, water, urban, in transport, infrastructure to be built. But we need to do it through a climate lens. Everything needs to be, we cannot take off that glass anymore that everything needs to be green, or as much as green as possible, with the sense of reality that we need to crowd in the private sector. There needs to be a profit for the private sector to come in. I mean, that cannot be forgotten. So in that light, ADB transformed itself last year to do a climate shift, because our EIB colleague has just mentioned that they transformed themselves to be the climate bank of the European Union. We have transformed ourselves to be the climate bank of the Asia-Pacific region. But we also need to transform ourselves to do a private sector shift. So in concomitantly to having done the climate shift, we are also transforming ourselves to be more private sector focused, and that our investments are also 30% private sector, because traditionally we've worked with sovereign borrowers.
I would just like to add to the infrastructure. I think one of the big challenges, especially for Europe, is electricity infrastructure. So with the renewable energy, it's great to have windmills, but it's intermittent. So you have it, you don't have it, so you have a lot of backup, and that means you need much better electricity network. I mean, we were testing, for instance, we wanted to install a photovoltaic farm, and then lead the electricity to our mill, and we were shocked. It was 3-4 times what the network could even provide. So we had, we have to build a direct line, and we see this problem across Europe. I mean, for the steel industry, that's a big topic, because you need mega infrastructure, and this infrastructure has to be paid for. And in many countries today, like in Germany and Austria, it's simply put onto the consumer. But if you calculate this, it will mean that the part just for the infrastructure will more than triple over the next 7 or 10 years. So this is a question then of how do you finance it? Should the end consumer finance it, which means business, families, etc.? Should we pay it from public funds? How do we do that? And actually there is no discussion.
Well, we are having it now.
Yeah.
How should we do it? Give me the answer.
I don't know the answer, but the European Union has to find a coherent answer. And for instance, say we pay it from public money, or we give incentives, because at the moment it's not done because it cannot be financed, because the returns are too low. And so everyone says, until this is not decided, I don't invest. Yeah. So I think there isn't a goal now. I don't have the solution now, because someone has to pay for it, but we have to make this decision one way or the other. Otherwise there is no funding, otherwise the infrastructure doesn't go, and then we have great windmills, etc., but we have to turn them off because we cannot use the electricity.
That's the reality.
I agree totally, and I'm very worried also that in Europe that we have become so bureaucratic, you know, sometimes that even to put up new windmills now takes more than 10 years from the very project takes form until you have the liability and you actually can move forward. So financing is not the only problem here. The problem is also that, and we have made all these rules, and which is great, that we have to make sure that we don't get into all these kind of biodiversity issues. Of course, we need to have both the renewable energies and the great biodiversity, but at the same time, right now, we are not doing neither. We are not doing great biodiversity, and we are not getting ahead of ourselves when it comes to renewable energy, because we are spending all our time talking about not in my backyard and not in your backyard, and we also need to save some frogs and some bats and everything like that. So we really need to make sure that we also look at ourselves in Europe and other places and make sure that we can move forward when it comes to not only windmills, but also other renewable energies, and we have to do it really fast. Yeah.
I could see a lot of people nodding along there with you when you said too much bureaucracy. I mean, that's again a debate that we're having a lot in Brussels, but many from the Commission would argue that you haven't seen bureaucracy. Look at Brexit. That was a real example of red tape and bureaucracy. So they argue that they need all that bureaucracy in order to get to...
But where did they leave the Great Britain? I'm not sure. That's a good example.
We do not have a representative from the Commission here with us to ask, but indeed they'll be hearing the message here from the panel loudly and clearly. We've just a couple of minutes left really to close and ask you all what you think is the missing ingredient here. What one systemic change do you think could accelerate financing for activities with a positive impact? You want to tackle that one?
I think we've talked a lot about how we can set up the ecosystem, what needs to be done both in terms of jump-starting and having a policy that makes Europe an industrial, decarbonized industry. But I think, and maybe that's a perspective that I would like to add, it's also going to need a lot of entrepreneurial risk. Yeah, I mean, of course we can count upon funding, but we also need to take risks to overcome this. For us, as a steel-making company, we are investing 3 billion. Of course, that is life-threatening for us to do this investment, yeah? But we need to do it because we are convinced that Europe and Germany need steel. Such as many people here also are convinced that Europe needs chemical industry. And for that, we are going to have to take an entrepreneurial risk, as we have always done in Europe. And I'm very convinced that we will continue to do that. But it's a chicken and egg discussion, and somebody needs to put the egg. Yeah? And then we can move forward. Yeah.
And a final nugget of advice. Oh, round of applause there.
I think just to repeat what we were saying today, if I had to choose one, it would be collaboration. We know we need a lot of funds. It's billions, it's trillions. We have tried to understand how many billions or trillions in this sector, in that sector. We know the numbers are massive. And we also know that nature or climate cannot wait and nature and climate doesn't care about political or jurisdictional barriers. We just need to move the money to have those bankable projects, scalable projects implemented. And I think in order to do that and create the enabling environment, amongst many other things, it is the collaboration between sectors, countries, companies, as we have heard today, that's the missing link.
And finally, Peter, where's the most opportunity for change?
Yeah, so some things were already taken, so it gets more difficult now to say something. But I think the European Union has gone down a way of being extremely prescriptive about everything. So for everything, there's target and a lot of reporting, and so it becomes more and more of a planned economy where we are moving, and we know from history that doesn't end well. And so I think the way must be more to positive and negative incentives instead of endless prescriptions.
Incentive, that is your key word. And Sophie Anderson, Lord Mayor of Copenhagen, final word with you.
Well, I think we need more decision making, and we need to do it fast. And at the same time, we need more citizen involvement, and that takes a long time. So,
well, we do have elections taking place in June, so hopefully citizens will mobilise and vote. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our panel. A round of applause. Enjoy the rest of the awards. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a lot about that CDP joint research report that is published today. It's a pulse check, really, on corporate financing of the green transition. And now we can find out even more about the nitty-gritty details of it by inviting up on stage Jennifer Sim. She is a partner and head of climate and sustainability for the UK and Ireland at Oliver Wyman, which is the company that co-authored the report. Jennifer, how are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Great. So lovely to have you with us here on stage. First question will be really on the obstacles. What obstacles are companies facing when it comes to funding the green transition?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Maeve, and thank you for having us. I think at Oliver Wyman, we are delighted to partner again with CDP to publish this report, getting the money moving. And as part of this research, we analysed over 1,600 companies that represent 89% of market capitalisation in Europe, so really good representation of the economy there. And we saw a lot of progress, right? We saw a lot of progress on adopting emissions targets. We saw progress on developing transition plans and also the emissions reductions themselves. But we also saw an implementation gap, and that is based on a framework that we looked at analysing those companies across 5 factors. So one is steering the business, looking at capital expenditure, decarbonising the supply chain, engaging with customers, and low-carbon product innovation. And the finding from the reports was that only 1 in 5 European companies that we looked at actually was making substantial progress in actually implementing transition plans. And you could ask, why is that? And one of the reasons that the European companies actually cited was access to capital was a key issue and a key concern in implementing transition plans. That's over a third of companies identified that as a problem, and actually nearly half of companies in the most capital-intensive sectors, the most carbon-intensive sectors that require the capital transitions, that's utilities, oil and gas, transportation, identified that as a concern. So we're seeing, actually, when we deep dived into some sectors, some of that playing out already. So in steel, which accounts for like 5% of European carbon emissions, we saw that the current investment gap there, if extrapolated forwards, would mean that there could be a 30% shortfall between the supply and demand of green steel in 2035. And in electric utilities, again, we estimated that around 1.9 trillion euros worth of investment is required to actually bring about the transition by 2030.
Wow.
But given the investment shortfall that already was observed in 2022, again, if we extrapolate that forwards, that could lead to a 285 billion gap in 2030. So, you know, lots of gaps highlighted, but also lots of opportunities that we can look to address as well.
Indeed, and beautifully articulated there. Congrats on remembering all those figures. Just on the report, we've seen how fundamental economics, they're just not moving fast enough when it comes to supporting change at scale. Why, do you think, and what are the solutions?
Yeah, I think there are challenges on both sides when we think about investment, when we think about funding. So both on the company side and on the financial institution side. I think on the company side, what we've seen is that in many kind of new green business models, the actual kind of profitability, the economics are currently not as attractive. They tend to be a little bit riskier. And actually, when asked, the companies cited challenges themselves, such as longer time horizons for return on investment, changing and uncertainty policy and regulatory environment. We heard earlier about, you know, some kind of bureaucracy and lengthy times for applications and so forth. And that's kind of generating some issues on the company side. Now, on the financial institution side, what we have seen is many financial institutions, so 2/3 of the companies that we looked at, they said they were making active steps to transition to net zero. But we are still seeing that gap, right? And what is creating that issue? Some of the economics there are kind of still not quite making sense to really scale that transition finance. And some of the issues cited by financial institutions are around the fact that some of those investments are still quite large, the time horizon's very long, some of those new technologies are not yet commercially proven or very dependent on policy. And so while they're engaging in some of this new activity, they're still kind of proving it for themselves as they're building those capabilities.
And I imagine you have a lot of recommendations as well in that report. Can you tell us some of them?
Yeah, I think, I mean, without going into all the recommendations in the reports, which I'm sure you'll all find when you read it, I think really coming out of this is a call for collective action. You know, companies, financial institutions, policymakers, they all play a role, and it really requires an ecosystem approach to move the economy. We saw some really nice examples doing the analysis. So one example was between a utilities company, a brewing company, and a steel producer, where the utilities company facilitated the heat transfer from the steel producer to the brewery and optimized all those processes. But we also see that actually a lot of this is also very dependent on policy change, right? Like creating the incentives, creating a stable policy environment. If we look at the automotive sector, that's one of the most powerful prototypes for this. Like, how can a new green business model actually really revolutionize a sector? And you can point to a lot of that, to the fact that there's the European ban on internal combustion engines by 2035. And when you look at the numbers, even though currently sale of EVs are only 13% of new car sales, already we're seeing that over 60% of R&D in that sector is in EV over the next 5 years. So we're seeing that policy certainty and direction actually allowing companies to lean into those areas and allowing the investment to flow behind it.
Wow, fascinating stuff. And of course, everyone can download that report by just using their badge and scanning the QR code, and they'll have access to that full report, which is fascinating. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us and for telling us all those details.
Great, thanks very much, Maeve.
Jennifer Sim there from Oliver Wyman. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the time has come to get to know the CEO of CDP, Sherry Madeira. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Maeve, as well. How do I follow Jennifer?
I don't know, but she's amazing. I cannot wait to read that report. It's your first CDP Awards.
It is.
Delighted to have you here on stage, not just for the fabulous view, but also to have joined such a fascinating organisation. Why did you decide to join?
Well, thank you very much for having me. This is almost the exact 6-month anniversary of me joining CDP, so I'm adding that to my many list of things to celebrate tonight with all of you. But of course, I'm 6 months in, and as you well know, CDP has been doing this for 23 years. And that means that actually this is an organization that's already built up incredible global partnerships. and building on that with not only supply chain members, we heard a number of them up here on this stage, but also financial institutions. Over 740 of them partner with us around the world to ask for data to be able to make decisions on. Those supply chain members represent $6.5 trillion worth of purchasing power, and they're putting it into action. And I guess, for me, it is an incredible honor to be part of how that movement has happened right from the beginning of when CDP was founded, and it thought we should be asking about data on climate to be able to make decisions. And now look at this ecosystem, which we're all a part of, and we all share and grow in because we take action on the data. The data itself, and just surfacing it, is a big lift, right? We know that. We understand from all of you who are disclosing to us, it's not an easy task. And that's not an apology, that's because this is really worth doing. But of course, data for data's sake is not what we're after. What we're looking for is making sure that that data is really used to take action. We want to be able to take positive action together and across the globe and understand what good looks like. And of course, we've heard a lot today about thinking about finance, move the money. That's a really strong signal and a phrase, and that's access to capital. That is one great way of using this data, but there are others. There's other ways, including the supply chain, including business efficiencies, retaining talent. They want to know about what your business is doing and how is it that data actually supports the statements you're making in the marketplace. So access to capital, business efficiencies, and maybe a lot of what we talk about out there on the floor, out there in the real world, is compliance. And that's coming fast and furious, thinking about mandatory disclosures, thinking about general climate requirements from many different corners. And Europe is a real leader there. So speaking about this here is really, really important. So I'm simple, right? Let's keep it simple. The data that CDP collects is all about the ABCs: access to capital, business efficiencies, and compliance. And if we can make sure that that data that you are spending the time being able to share and report is being used many times, we actually are diverting our attention to the action as opposed to just the data. And that's exciting.
It is very exciting. And what's also very exciting is I believe there's some changes afoot for CDP. What's coming up this year?
Well, I think a lot of the changes are about making sure that we're aligning to those three things that I spoke about. This is going to be a journey, and we hope you're all on this journey with us. We're very open to thinking about partnership and how it is that we can make this a reality. It's about making sure the data is fit for the use case. So one of the commitments we've made this year is we're going to be completely aligned with the ISSB S2 standard. We also have a commitment with an MOU with EFRAG, who are behind, obviously, the ESRS and CSRD. And that makes us really, really part of that ecosystem, not only here in Europe, where when you do business here, you have to think about those disclosures. But actually, in my travels in the last 6 months to various places across the US, Brazil, thinking about Japan, thinking about China, thinking about India, where we also have presences, those companies are very interested in understanding how it is when they share their data, they can also be able to use it in various different jurisdictions. So that's super exciting. And the reason why we can do this is because we're creating a new platform and a new technology. And is that going to be completely transformational this year? Not completely transformational this year, but it's a definite step in the right direction. And we actually need all of your help to be able to continue to make that journey even better. Because actually using the technology, tagging the data, making it as powerful as possible, that's actually a commitment CDP has to all of you and all of the ecosystem. So those changes are actually very significant changes.
And Sherry, it's just 7 p.m. We've had so much food for thought on stage here since 4:30 when we kicked off this 2024 edition of the CDP Awards. Can you just share with us what have been your main takeaways from what you've heard?
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, when I started getting involved in thinking about data and climate and green finance and thinking about sustainable finance and sustainability, actually you needed to remind people about the data being important, that the data played a role here. And actually, we need to think about what we can measure, we can manage. And actually, what I heard on this very stage a little bit earlier was that someone fell in love with the data.
Yeah.
I love that, because actually, the data is not a nice to have. It is a must-have in order for you to secure your customers, your financiers and your investors, your talent, and your workforce. That's pretty compelling right to the core. So our conversations are with CEOs, they're with CFOs, they're with CSOs, and they're with the board. And that's where it needs to be.
Thank you so much. Shari Madera, the CEO of CDP.
Thank you very much.
Well, we've now reached the end of our discussions on stage, and this brings our live stream to an end. Big thank you to all of you who've been joining us this afternoon, celebrating with us the CDP Awards 2024. Stay tuned for a resume that will be coming up on Euronews in just a couple of weeks, and also you can find the whole block on the ChangeNOW website. Thank you so much for your attention. And now to those of you in the room, you're invited to go downstairs to the Salon Champ de Mars for some bubbles, followed by a special private guided tour of the ChangeNOW Summit. And you'll actually be with the exhibition curator, Ronan Delacroix. So please enjoy that. And then we'll be meeting back up on stage here at 8 o'clock to celebrate you and give the actual awards, which is of course why we're all here. But just bear in mind, we'll be transforming this room into a party room to celebrate all of you, the cities and the companies. So please bring everything with you, your bags, your jackets, your phones, your wallets, everything. Because when you come back, this will look a little bit different. The lights will be dimmed and we'll be handing out the awards. And of course, there will be more champagne, there'll be some food and lots of networking. So enjoy your special tour and we'll see you later. Thanks for your attention.